What would you do if, while preparing for takeoff with more than 100 souls on board, you saw a woman standing in the middle of the runway, her white figure illuminated by your landing lights, yet the control tower insisted there was no one there? But before we go any further, I want to ask you something that comes from the heart. Are you willing to receive the blessings that the Virgin Mary has lovingly prepared for you? If your answer is yes, write in the comments, "Yes, I am ready for Mary's miracles." And if you haven't yet joined our family, subscribe now, because here, each day, we witness the tender love and mighty power of the Mother of God. This is the true story of Captain David Lawson, an experienced pilot who witnessed something science could not explain, a mysterious apparition that would turn a routine flight into a moment of divine encounter, and a miracle that the aviation world would never forget. It was a calm night, the kind of night every pilot prays for. The air was steady, visibility perfect, the hum of the engines like a promise that nothing could go wrong. Flight 112 was preparing for takeoff from a regional airport just past midnight. The runway shimmered beneath the lights, slick from a passing drizzle. Inside the cockpit, Captain David Lawson went through his checklist, steady, methodical, precise. For him, faith was found only in instruments, not in prayers. The control tower confirmed, runway 27 cleared for departure. He eased the throttle forward, engines rising to a confident roar. The aircraft began its roll, smooth, flawless. Then came the voice. "Tower, this is Flight 112, do you have ground crew on the runway?" Static. Then confusion. "Negative, 112. Runway's clear." Why? A pause. "Because I see someone. A woman. Standing just ahead of us." The tower went silent. The radar showed nothing. The runway cameras, clear. Inside the cockpit, Lawson's co-pilot leaned forward, squinting. "You see that too?" Lawson nodded slowly. "Affirmative." At the far end of the light stood a woman dressed in white, motionless, her figure faintly luminous against the blackness of the tarmac. Her outline shimmered slightly, like a mirage, yet her presence felt solid, undeniable. "Probably fog," Lawson muttered, though the night air was crisp and clear. But when the woman turned her head toward them, something in him froze. Her face was calm. Serene. Almost radiant. And though the cockpit was sealed tight, the faint scent of roses filled the air. "Tower, are you sure?" Lawson said again, his voice tense. "Affirmative, Captain. Thermal scan reads negative. There's no one out there." But the woman remained. She wasn't walking. She wasn't waving. She was simply standing there, gazing directly at the approaching aircraft, as though guarding it. Lawson felt his chest tighten. Every instinct told him to abort takeoff. He cut the throttle, the engines whining down, the plane slowing to a crawl. For a moment, everything went still. Then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. The co-pilot turned pale. "Where did she?" Lawson didn't answer. He scanned the runway again, heart pounding, but there was only rain-slick pavement gleaming beneath the lights. "Tower, this is Flight 112. Visual anomaly disappeared. Holding position." A beat of static, then the tower's voice returned, calm, almost too calm. "Copy that, 112. We have no visual confirmation of any person on the runway." No one in the control room spoke for several seconds. The weather was clear. No fog, no reflection, no heat signature. Lawson's hands trembled slightly as he reset the controls. "We'll resume in 5 minutes," he said, forcing steadiness into his voice. But the image wouldn't leave him. That woman, so vividly real, so impossibly there, her face lit not by the runway lights, but by something gentler, almost celestial. 15 minutes later, Flight 112 was cleared once again. The engines roared to life, wheels rolling against the smooth concrete. As the plane lifted through the darkness, the runway below shimmered briefly, and Lawson thought he saw, just for a heartbeat, that same white figure standing at its end, watching them rise into the sky. He didn't mention it to his co-pilot. Not that night. But when the scent of roses returned in the cockpit an hour later, he knew. Whatever he had seen on that runway hadn't stayed behind. Captain David Lawson had flown through lightning, turbulence, and the dead of night more times than he could count. But what happened on the runway that evening was different, not dangerous, not chaotic, but impossible. He didn't mention it in his post-flight debrief. Not to the crew, not to the tower, not even to his wife when he came home the next morning. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, the woman in white, her face calm yet filled with a sadness that seemed to stretch beyond human expression. And that scent, the roses. Sweet. Clean. Otherworldly. It lingered even after he'd showered and changed. The next morning, he drove back to the airport. Not as a pilot, but as a man trying to prove to himself that what he'd seen wasn't real. The early sun shimmered on the tarmac. Maintenance crews worked, mechanics laughed, fuel trucks rumbled past. Everything was ordinary again. Yet when he walked the length of runway 27, he found something strange. A faint white mark on the asphalt, circular, smooth, like frost, though the morning was warm. He knelt down, touched it. The scent of roses returned, faint, fleeting. He froze. Before he could think, a voice broke the silence. Captain Lawson. It was Officer Delgado, from airport security. They said you asked to see me. Lawson hesitated. Yes. I need to check last night's surveillance footage. Delgado led him to the operations room. The two of them watched the feed, grainy footage from multiple cameras. There it was, Flight 112, lights glowing, ready for takeoff. But there was no woman. No movement. No shadow. Nothing but the reflection of the plane's landing lights on wet pavement. Delgado shrugged. Maybe glare, Captain. Happens all the time. Lawson nodded, though he knew what glare looked like. This had been something else, something alive. Before he left, Delgado added, funny thing though, the radar logged a visual obstruction for exactly 5 seconds. No heat source. No object. Just static. That night, Lawson sat at his desk, opened his flight log, and began to write. Not for the airline. Not for any official record. This was something else, a confession. He wrote. I saw her. A woman. Not a passenger, not a reflection. She was real, more real than the ground under my feet. When I looked into her face, I felt peace and sorrow at once. Like she knew everything I'd ever doubted. Then he stopped, staring at the words. He had never been a religious man. He respected faith, but it was something that belonged to others, not to pilots who trusted only instruments and math. He tried to laugh it off. I'm a pilot, not a prophet, he muttered. But the laughter died quickly. A week passed before anyone else mentioned it. During a pre-flight check, his co-pilot, First Officer Rachel Kim, leaned toward him and said quietly, Sir, I didn't want to bring this up earlier, but I saw her too. Lawson looked up sharply. Rachel nodded. A woman. On the runway. She looked at us, then she was gone. He studied her face, she wasn't joking. And the smell, he asked. Her eyes widened. Roses. The two sat in silence, the sound of the wind pressing softly against the cockpit windows. It wasn't hallucination. It wasn't imagination. They had both seen her. Rachel broke the silence first. I told a priest about it. He said sometimes Our Lady appears not in churches, but in places of danger. To protect. Lawson frowned. You think she was protecting us? Rachel shrugged. You were about to take off. What if something was wrong and she stopped us? Lawson wanted to argue, but he couldn't. Because when they aborted takeoff that night, a mechanic later discovered a small hydraulic leak in the right landing gear, one that could have failed midair. The realization hit like a jolt. If they had taken off as planned, it might have ended in disaster. That night, Lawson returned to the runway again, standing at the exact spot where he'd seen her. The wind whipped through the lights. Far in the distance, a plane roared into the sky. He looked up, for the first time in years, not as a pilot, but as a man wondering if heaven had tried to speak to him. "Why me?" he whispered. "I'm not a believer." The air shifted, calm, almost warm, and that faint fragrance returned once more, drifting on the wind like a quiet answer. He closed his eyes. For the first time in decades, David Lawson prayed. Not for safety, not for certainty, but for understanding. Word of the incident at the airport spread quietly at first, like a rumor no one wanted to believe. A pilot claiming to have seen a woman on the runway. A priestly explanation. It all sounded too strange for the sterile world of aviation, where checklists and data ruled above faith and feeling. Yet whispers persisted. The ground staff talked about the lady of runway 27. The tower crew joked nervously that Captain Lawson's flight might have had a guardian angel. And though most dismissed it as fatigue or reflection, one piece of evidence refused to go away: the infrared recording. The airport's thermal camera, set up near the hangar for maintenance tracking, had captured something unusual. 5 seconds of interference, static, blur, then a faint outline, a figure standing exactly where Lawson claimed to have seen her. No color, no heat signature, just a white silhouette framed in the rain. It wasn't proof, not in the scientific sense. But it was enough to make even skeptics pause. When Lawson reviewed the footage with airport investigators, no one spoke for a long time. Finally, the head technician murmured, "It's probably just a glitch." But the woman's outline was too defined, too still. Even in the grainy footage, she seemed to be looking at the plane. One investigator whispered, "That's human-shaped." The technician snapped, "It's an anomaly. Let's leave it at that." Lawson said nothing. He just stared at the screen. Because deep down, he knew exactly what, or who, he had seen. Still, the pilot in him needed logic. He began to search for answers the only way he knew how, through precision. He spent hours poring over flight data, maintenance logs, weather records. Nothing explained it. But when a maintenance engineer named Carla Ruiz approached him privately, she added a new layer to the mystery. "Captain," she said quietly, "you're not the first to see something out there." Lawson blinked. "What do you mean?" Carla hesitated, lowering her voice. "About 10 years ago, before the runway expansion, there was a storm. A nurse was driving home after her shift at St. Joseph's Hospital. Her car lost control and skidded right across the old service road that used to run beside the runway. She didn't survive." Lawson frowned. "And?" "She was found clutching a rosary," Carla said. "They say she had been praying when the car hit. Some of the ground crew back then claimed they'd seen a woman in white walking near that stretch on foggy nights. We thought it was just stories." Lawson's pulse quickened. "Her name? Maria Alvarez." That night, Lawson couldn't shake the thought. He found himself driving to the small cemetery on the outskirts of town. Rain fell softly as he walked between headstones until he found it. Maria Alvarez, 1968 to 2009. She prayed until the end. A single wilted rose lay against the stone. The air smelled faintly of rain and, impossibly, roses again. He stood there for a long time, hat in hand, the raindrops streaking down his face like tears he didn't realize he'd shed. "Were you the one I saw?" he whispered. "Or was it someone, higher?" A sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, bending the grass in one direction, toward the sky. In the weeks that followed, more stories began to emerge. A flight attendant swore she saw a flash of white by the window during a thunderstorm approach. A security officer claimed to hear faint footsteps on an empty tarmac. A passenger reported smelling roses during descent, though no flowers were aboard. Each time, the reports were dismissed, logged as fatigue, imagination, or electrical interference. But every story shared one detail: a calm, maternal presence. The local parish priest, Father Samuel Rojas, visited Lawson after hearing the rumors. Sitting in the pilot's kitchen over coffee, he listened quietly to the story from beginning to end. When Lawson finished, Father Rojas said softly, "You said she looked peaceful." Yes, Lawson replied. But it wasn't ordinary peace. It was, like she knew something I didn't. Like she was warning me, but not with fear, with love. The priest nodded. The Blessed Virgin has appeared in stranger places than this, my son. In Fatima, in Rwanda, in the Andes. Why not here? The mother goes where her children are in danger. Lawson leaned back, troubled. But why me? Why show herself to a man who barely believes? Father Rojas smiled gently. Because faith is not given to the perfect, Captain. It's given to the ones who need saving. That night, Lawson opened his flight log again. He turned to the page where he had written his first account and added a new note. If she was warning us, then it worked. The hydraulic failure would have brought us down. She saved every soul on that plane. I owe her everything, and I don't even know why she chose me. He closed the log and stared out the window at the distant glow of the runway lights. For the first time in his life, he wished for another flight through the night. Just to see if she would appear again. And somewhere beyond the clouds, perhaps she did. Months passed. The world of aviation had long moved on, but Captain Lawson couldn't. He returned to duty, still flying commercial routes, though every time his plane ascended into the night sky, part of him wondered, would she appear again? The story might have faded into rumor entirely, had it not been for a routine runway inspection one quiet morning that changed everything. A maintenance crew repairing electrical lines near runway 27 uncovered a small metallic object buried in the gravel beside the tarmac. It was old, almost blackened with soot, yet unmistakably familiar, a rosary, its beads worn smooth, its crucifix faintly gleaming even under years of dirt. The team handed it to the airport's lost and found office, assuming it was a misplaced item from some traveler. But when the serial records were checked, nothing. No one had reported it missing. And that's when an elderly security officer, George Milton, who had been working at the airport since the 1990s, walked by and froze. He picked up the rosary gently, squinting at the small initials engraved on the back of the crucifix. M.A. His voice trembled. Maria Alvarez, he whispered. When Lawson was called to see it, the moment felt surreal. The same faint scent of roses filled the air. He ran his fingers over the metal beads, the cool touch almost sacred. This was hers, he murmured. And as he spoke, an inexplicable calm washed over the room, that same presence he'd felt on the night of the storm. The airport management, of course, issued no official comment. But Father Rojas later said during Mass, sometimes heaven leaves its fingerprints on the earth, not to prove, but to remind. Soon after, the story made its way into the local press, though names were omitted to protect identities. The headline read, "Pilot credits heavenly intervention for avoiding mid-air disaster." While skeptics debated and online forums argued about optical illusions, one quiet fact stood out. A malfunction that should have caused total system loss somehow stabilized just long enough for a safe landing, precisely after Lawson's report of the woman on the runway. The maintenance report even confirmed it. The hydraulic line had ruptured during takeoff and sealed itself temporarily due to sudden pressure reversal, a phenomenon engineers called virtually impossible. Virtually impossible, or divinely allowed. Months later, Lawson received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a photo, one of the few known images of Maria Alvarez, taken during her time volunteering at St. Joseph's Hospital. In the picture, she held a small rosary. The same one. On the back of the photo, written in elegant handwriting, were the words, "The mother never abandons those who call upon her." Lawson sat alone in his study for a long time, staring at the photo, unable to speak. He began attending Mass again, quietly slipping into the back pew where no one noticed him. At first, he didn't know how to pray. His words felt clumsy, uncertain, the way a man might speak a forgotten language. But he prayed anyway. He prayed for the passengers he'd saved. For Maria Alvarez. And for the woman, whoever she truly was, who had stood before his plane like a guardian between heaven and earth. Father Rojas would later say, faith doesn't always begin in churches. Sometimes it begins on runways. The most haunting part came a year later. Lawson was invited to give a talk at a pilots' conference about flight safety and crisis management. During the Q&A, a young pilot raised his hand and asked, "Sir, do you believe in miracles?" Lawson smiled faintly and looked down at the small rosary he now carried in his pocket every day. "Miracles," he repeated. "I believe they don't need proof, they just need eyes willing to see." The room fell silent. And for a moment, it felt as though every hum of the lights, every breath in that hall, carried the weight of something sacred, a whisper from beyond the clouds. That night, back in his hotel room, he placed the rosary on the nightstand. Outside the window, lightning flashed faintly in the distance, a storm forming far away, over the same skies where it all began. Lawson whispered into the silence, "If you're out there, thank you." And though no one answered, a single drop of rain tapped softly against the glass. Followed by another, and another, until the world outside was filled with the sound of rain and roses. Years later, Captain Lawson's story became something of a quiet legend among pilots. Not an official case, not something you'd find in the aviation manual, but a whispered tale passed around during overnight flights, when the cockpit lights were dim and the stars outside looked close enough to touch. They called it the miracle of Runway 27. And though most who repeated it did so with a half-smile, unsure whether they truly believed it, those who had once felt death brush past at 30,000 feet found comfort in the thought that maybe, just maybe, heaven sometimes walked the runways. One day, years after the incident, Lawson received an unexpected invitation from the Diocese of Tampa. A new chapel was being dedicated near the airport, Our Lady of the Skies, built by the community of aviation workers who had long heard the story of the woman in white. Lawson arrived quietly, standing near the back as sunlight poured through stained glass depicting the Virgin Mary extending her hands over an airplane. He felt something stir deep inside him, gratitude, humility, and an ache that words couldn't describe. As the choir sang Ave Maria, he realized this chapel wasn't just a monument. It was a living promise, a reminder that faith can bloom even on tarmac and steel. After the ceremony, Father Rojas, now older and walking with a cane, found him outside. "You came," the priest said warmly. "I couldn't stay away," Lawson replied, smiling. "I owe her that much." The priest looked at him knowingly. "You've changed, Captain." Lawson nodded. "Yes. She changed me." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the same rosary, still slightly tarnished from the years. "It's strange," he said. "Every time I fly, I feel calm, like someone's with me up there. Like the skies aren't empty anymore." Father Rojas touched his shoulder. "They never were." That night, after returning home, Lawson sat on his porch overlooking the airfield lights in the distance. He thought of Maria Alvarez, the woman whose prayer had perhaps bridged heaven and earth, and of the Virgin Mary, who had appeared not in a grand cathedral or holy mountain, but on a rain-slick runway, among engines and fuel and human fear. Faith, he realized, doesn't need silence to be sacred. It can bloom in noise, in storm, in doubt, as long as the heart remains open. Years later, when Captain Lawson finally retired, he left behind more than logbooks and medals. He left behind a small plaque mounted discreetly at the base of the control tower. Dedicated to Our Lady of the Skies, who guards those who travel through the storm. Beneath it, engraved in smaller letters, were the words, "Faith begins the moment reason reaches its limit." To this day, pilots landing on runway 27 sometimes report the faint smell of roses in the cockpit. A few even claim that during heavy rain, they see a brief flicker of white on the tarmac, just for a second, before it disappears into the mist. The control tower always checks. There's never anyone there. But the legend continues. And so does the quiet belief that one woman, through faith and prayer, once stood between catastrophe and miracle. Perhaps that's how heaven speaks, not with thunder or command, but through a whisper in the rain, a light in the storm, or a calm voice that says, "Do not be afraid." Because miracles aren't always seen. Sometimes, they're felt, in the hum of an engine that keeps running, the heartbeat that steadies after fear, or in the scent of roses where there should be only rain. The skies above remember. And for those who still believe, so do we.